Hey ladies, this is Mocha Mommy here bringing you another video. And in this video, I want to talk to you ladies about Black history and Black excellence. The reason why I want to talk about that, because I feel as if it's a part of our culture that is getting very ignored in the social media space. And I feel it's important to put it into context, into the conversations that are happening today. I also understand that a lot of my audience is very young women, and they may have not had exposure to this information. And also a lot of women who were born outside the United States, so they may not know this information either. I also see the irony in the fact that this is a divestment channel and that I do so much Black history. My video about Stop Picking on Pick Misha covered Black history. I talked about it when I talked about Black people and our relationship to substance abuse and the underground economy, and putting that in historical context. I've also talked about it in my Mother's Day video, and most especially in my When Did Educated Black Women Become a Problem series. So I understand the irony of it, but I really think this is information that you ladies could benefit from. So I'll begin with my great-grandfather, who basically started our family's trajectory on the Black excellence path, okay? This was my father's grandfather. He came up from the Jim Crow South around the turn of the century or early 1920s, okay? Now, this was not uncommon. Very much like, like Song of Solomon, the novel by Toni Morrison. A lot of times you may not have had a clear idea about what your family's history looked like before the Great Migration. A lot of times, a lot of those men who migrated didn't keep up with their families or tell you a lot about their growing up or their upbringing or where they were from. It's almost like they created a new identity when they moved north. So my great-grandfather, I know, started building his wealth as a property owner. He would buy these dilapidated properties or between Brooklyn and Queens. And then, he would, I guess not rent them out, but he would give people rooms in exchange for labor, other migrating Black people, rooms in exchange for labor. So he'd buy this dilapidated property. He'd let you stay there rent free in exchange for you fixing up the property, in exchange for your labor. He also did the same thing in his grocery store. He'd give you groceries every week in exchange for a certain amount of labor. And that is how he really built his wealth. My great-grandfather went on to get married and have 9 children, 5 boys and 4 girls. Now, the 4 girls, they definitely did a lot of the Black excellence culture, like cotillions. They were very active in church. They were very big on etiquette because the expectation was that they were going to marry into prominent Black families, Black boule families that would help to perpetuate the wealth of my great-grandfather and his businesses. For instance, one of his daughters went on to marry a church pastor of a very prominent church. Another one of his daughters went on to marry someone in the distribution industry for Coca-Cola Company. All right. Basically because then Black grocery stores, they didn't always have very good access to distribution for dry goods, canned goods, things that were manufactured for the majority culture. So what happened was when my great aunt married into that family, he always had Coca-Cola in stock because, somehow Coke would always fall off of a truck somewhere and it would end up stocking his grocery store. Coca-Cola product. In fact, to this day, supply chain logistics remain one of the biggest obstacles to Black-owned businesses. So imagine if the narrative online started switching from how CDL having, truck driving Black men should be entitled to harems of fit, feminine, and friendly, submissive Black women to how can we begin to own these supply chain routes? How can we begin to own the raw materials that we're shipping in these trucks? And how can we get them into the hands of more Black business owners? We'd have a completely different community. Now, I digress. Back to my great-grandfather's 5 sons. They were even more pressure on them to succeed in Black excellence culture. He gave his 5 sons 3 choices, my great-grandfather did. That was to go to an HBCU, get a trade, or join the service. That's what they called it back then, the service, join the military. So his oldest son ended up going to Fisk. Now, that was very problematic. And from what I understand, because I wasn't there, that ended up being a source of contention between my great-grandfather and my great-uncle. We'll call him Uncle Norman. That was a huge source of contention. Because my great-grandfather never really talked about his experience below the Mason-Dixon. He didn't want any of his children to go below the Mason-Dixon. Now, there are HBCUs that are in the North and Midwest. You have the ones in the Midwest, Wilberforce and Central State. And I told you ladies in my Mother's Day video that a lot of the vagrancy laws in the Midwest at the turn of the century all the way up into the Civil Rights era were very similar to the Jim Crow South. And in fact, we have a historically Black fraternity and sorority that were founded in order to combat that. So this way, when the streetlights came on, you knew of somebody's house you can go into. You had a soror or a fraternity brother whose house you can go into to keep yourself safe. And it became a network for traveling professional Black people throughout the Midwest. We also had Lincoln and Cheney University in Pennsylvania. So there were HBCUs above the Mason-Dixon. But my uncle decided on Fisk. And he also, his youngest brother ended up then following in his footsteps. They both went into something that was very similar to civil engineering, municipal building. And that ended up being helpful to them because they had a brother-in-law who was in with the city. And that is how they ended up building wealth through their sister's marriage. And also their brother-in-law kind of educated them about what was happening with infrastructure building in New York at the time. This is when you saw like a lot of the bridges and tunnels get revitalized and get renewed. Some of the old pre-war buildings being knocked down and turned into skyscrapers and high rises for building. They were very much a part of that because their brother-in-law had told them what to study at Fisk, and then therefore they were able to build wealth through that. Now, as my Uncle Norman kind of ascended to be the family's patriarch, he would help pay for his nieces and nephews to go to college, my father being part of that. But he was kind of like the conversation that you saw on the Cosby Show. You can go to any college you want, but my money is going to Hillman, right? He was very much like, well, I'll help you pay for school, but I'll pay for it all if you go to Fisk, but I'll pay for only part of it if you go to another HBCU. And my father, being more enlightened, was like, well, you can go to any HBCU you want. So again, still allowing us to have a choice, but only having a choice among HBCUs because he was not going to pay for anything else. So again, another, upstanding Black man and then I also had another uncle who I was very, very close to. We'll call him Uncle Harold. So Uncle Harold was in the Negro Leagues. He played for the Newark Eagles, one of the only few teams to beat the Kansas City Monarchs. That was a dynasty over that time. He then ended up going into the industry, with athletic training and distribution, worked for Louisville Slugger for a while, worked for Wilson Sporting Goods and things like that after his career in the Negro Leagues. But I definitely know that my love of the game really came from spending a lot of time with him. And my husband and him were also very close because they shared that love of the game. I also had a uncle who was in the service, served in that post-World War II to Vietnam era. And this is another source of contention that I have with the online discourse among the Black manosphere. Now, if you had served in that post-World War II up to Vietnam era, a lot of times the VA hospital would treat you with opioids, okay? Then opioid addiction ran very rampant, and that very much led to the heroin addiction that we saw throughout the 50s and 60s in the Black community. Okay. Now, this is another narrative that goes around that Barack Obama didn't do anything for Black people. Barack Obama had posthumously, decorated and awarded a lot of segregated Black units during the World War II and Vietnam era. He also had awarded a lot of our living legends who had served in segregated units and at that time hadn't been awarded like flying crosses, Congressional Medals of Honor, as they should have deserved. He also appointed General Shinseki, who was a Hawaiian Pacific Islander who had served in the World War II era. Now, this appointment was very controversial because General Shinseki was a paper pusher. He did have a Ranger badge, but for the most part, he was kind of a paper pusher for most of his military career. The reason why is because once PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, became a claim that people can file VA for VA compensation, that then opened that up to a lot of the World War II and Vietnam era veterans who also suffered from PTSD. There were years and years and years of backlogs and claims. So myself, who was a military contractor at that time, and my older sister, who was also a board certified psychiatrist, had a 7-year contract with a defense contractor to evaluate PTSD claims going back 30, 40 years. Now, if the Black community decided, right, if Black men online decided like, hey, instead of blaming Black women for welfare in 1965, let's look into our history. Let's look into our family's history and get the compensation and the claims for our uncles who had their units posthumously awarded, who had their segregated units recognized by the Department of Defense, thanks to Barack Obama. Why don't we start getting them recognized and start figuring out if they had a PTSD claim so our family can get financial compensation from the VA? Because we know that the draft was definitely very racist. The Vietnam draft was very racist, where they put a lot of Black men, despite being in college, despite being in leadership positions, on the front lines and gave them the worst assignments and the worst equipment. Why don't we file claims on their behalf? Why don't we all of a sudden go to these military credit unions that help award dependents low interest mortgage, low interest credit cards, low interest car loans, and a lot of other financial benefits? Why don't we get that compensation that our families deserve, that our mothers and grandmothers and aunties and great aunts couldn't get because they had to go to the welfare program? Why don't we get the compensation that they deserve for being widows or baby mamas of veterans or draftees of the Vietnam War? I would take them more seriously. But again, Thought Crimes has been really the only podcast who ever really brought that up to the Black community, saying how we deserve compensation for what happened to us in the VA from that post-World War II era all the way through Vietnam. Now, I also had another uncle who was pretty involved in the labor movement. Just like my grandfather helped to integrate the Electrical Brothers Union, I had another uncle who had helped dock workers, get equity in their labor. Now, he had sort of a duplicitous life, right? Where he was on the front lines for a lot of Black workers, but behind the scenes, him and his wife, we'll call her Aunt Josephine. My father loves her, and would never speak ill against her, all right? And I think he was in denial for a long time about Aunt Josephine, who was a moonshiner, basically. So she would moonshine throughout these dock laborers in New Jersey and New York, They had like a moonshine in business that as the docks began opening up in Connecticut and Black workers started integrating that workforce, they would moonshine up into Connecticut and started to try to go to the shipyards that they were then, that they were instrumental in integrating and bringing fair labor practices to for Black workers. They were trying to move further north. That's when they ran into the Kennedys, the Kennedys that became in the White House. They were liquor bootleggers from the Prohibition era. They were doing rye Irish whiskey and they were selling it to dock workers. And that was very interesting because my uncles always had an issue saying like, oh, Black moonshiners end up in jail, but white liquor bootleggers end up in the White House. That's where, if you've ever heard that phrase, that's where that came from. So just know that the underground economy has always been part of our history. Now, when segregation was the law, my aunt's moonshining business was probably one of the more lucrative things that one of the more lucrative family businesses that we had, honestly, even more so than, or just as much so as the legitimate ones. But The difference was my Aunt Josephine who was also the church secretary, and I'm putting that in air quotes, okay? And they kind of used one of the church buildings to run like an illegal moonshining gambling ring, even though it was attached to the church. Listen, ladies, no judgment here. This is what happened, okay? This is our history. Now, a lot of times there will be a lot of men who would gamble their paychecks away, drink their paychecks away. And my Aunt Josephine would then have the church bring a basket of food by the house, bring some clothes by the house, bring the kids school books, because they knew that the father was an alcoholic or a gambler, right? So because those things were contained within the community, the church had this benevolent arm for, I guess, like the sins that they were doing behind the scenes, with my aunt as a church secretary. Oh, pastor, go pray for this family and then go send them these basket of canned goods, which also came from my great-grandfather's grocery store that fell off the back of the Coca-Cola truck. Y'all follow me? Okay. So again, the illegal economy, that underground economy, built a lot of Black wealth too. So we have to understand that once segregation kind of ended and people were able to work all kinds of places, my Aunt Josephine, because they were buying liquor from other stores, now couldn't take care of those families, right? Because number one, she didn't have the money, and number two, she was no longer connected to those families. Once Black people were able to gamble in Atlantic City, they were no longer gambling in these bingo halls or church halls or dining halls, right? And then the church wasn't getting money to have that benevolent arm. So again, that's why you get some people from the greatest generation, the silent generation, talk about how integration was one of the worst things that happened in the Black community. So even though I would never justify my family's participation in the underground economy, I sort of understand where they were coming from like the indentured servitude labor that my great-grandfather had done in order to become a property owner, including the fixing the books and cooking the books of the illegal logistics of getting segregated grocery stores stocked, creating a moonshine industry, because from what I understand, liquor bootlegging, even after prohibition, still was really dangerous. So it was almost better in their minds that you drink Aunt Josephine's blackberry moonshine as opposed to going to the Irish Catholic liquor distributors, because if you didn't pay her, she would just send her husband or her sons to rough you up on the docks where they knew you worked and take your paycheck, versus ending up at the bottom of the East River because you messed with the Irish mafia. It was probably better to be with, my Aunt Josephine and all the number running that she was running out of the back of the church. Yeah, I know. It probably was better that you were, because there that there was going to be a definitive winner and you would know a winner in the community, unlike the lottery system today where it makes billions and still nobody ever really wins. Nobody ever really wins. So I understand their thought process, and I would never justify it, but I do understand it. But what I can say that we can learn from it is that the past was not as idealistic as they make it think, as we may think. And also, too, there's a lot we can still learn from them today as far as protecting and providing our educational legacy, protecting the legacy of those who have served in our armed forces under very rough and difficult and challenging conditions, but still managed to serve honorably. We have to make sure that we're honoring that legacy, as well as getting the benefits that we're entitled to as dependents. I definitely made it a point to, as I was learning about that process, to tell my cousins and, and that side of the family, because, they were owed that. And luckily, because my great grandmother was so much of a, as you ladies would say, mammy, and constantly putting him in rehab and constantly putting him in the different VA hospitals because of his addiction problem, we were able to have documentation to say that, yes, he had an opioid addiction. and also bringing the awareness to you young ladies who are still contemplating your career or considering a new career. Really consider supply chain logistics. It's one of the biggest issues that Black women business owners really do struggle with. And by learning more about it, you're going to be able to facilitate a lot of young business owners who are be coming up in the next generation. Also, too, accounting services, I'm starting to realize, is another industry where as tax laws change, sometimes smaller businesses might not have access to those type of accounting and bookkeeping services. So ladies, make sure you keep your ear to the pavement when it comes to that. So I just wanted to give you ladies our history and know that it's not as idealistic as some may make it sound, but it doesn't mean that knowing it doesn't bring to light other opportunities for us to learn and grow from. This is Mocha Mommy, and I'll see you in the next video.